Capitalism, socialism, communism in the US. Which one is the most beneficial? Can there be a mixed economy? What about all the various economic systems that existed across this hemisphere for tens of thousands of years before either of these were thought of? Hello, my name is Francisco Escobar, and Latin Entertainment presents Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator, like a hungry carnivore when I'm breaking through the.
We have an expert panel ready to discuss the impact of capitalism, socialism, and communism. But first, please check out our fundraising initiative for this episode. Anti-Conquista, an anti-imperialist media collective. Fund the resistance, become a patron, as all donations fund socialist organizations in the global south. Also, this episode's business highlight is Sofrito Media Group, a multimedia company that manages and produces branded projects that appeal to the Latino / Hispanic segment, such as Sofrito for Your Soul, Radio Capicu, and Capicu Poetry and Cultural Showcase. Now let's get into our panel. We have Valente Hernandez, Alex Sandoval, Ramiro Funes from Anticonquista, Alba Isabel, Arnold Arnes from New Marta, and Darshan Alina Campos from Migrating University and Decolonial Business Academy. Thank you all for joining us. And for our first question, which economic system do you prefer, and what cons do the others two have?
I prefer socialism, and the faults of the other two in capitalism would be the wealth concentration, and for communism, it will be the concentration of power.
Thank you. Deshaun?
I'm none of the three. I work for decolonization, financial reparations, and repatriation. And just having studied all the world systems and the kind of work that I do, and given the realities of the climate crisis and how they're impacting our different communities, we need local living economies, and what that's going to look like given the historical differences we've experienced and the way that we're now being positioned, given Mother Nature and all the motherfuckers in power with their guns. Yeah, no, I resign from all three. So I want to see my people figure out what it means to create a beloved community in the context of absolute chaos and crisis and grief that has been both like under acknowledged and still unfolding. And so for me, fuck wealth concentration. We need to figure out, how to share wealth. But a lot of that is around redefinition, like wealth is clean air, wealth is my ability to go to the beach and not, feel scared for my bodily integrity.
Thank you for sharing, Deshaun. Valente, which economic system do you prefer?
For capitalism, and the reason I'm against socialism and communism is one, communism, I feel its incentives are not structurally aligned to minorities. It's more the majority gets to decide where everyone's going to go. And I believe that socialism sometimes incentivizes programs that become bloated and they become very inefficient, and which drains the communities or societies or individuals' ability to create something great. And the reason I am for capitalism is because I've seen capitalism in my own life take people from nothing to something amazing. I don't believe capitalism is only, the only true form. I believe a mixed economy is the best, to be honest. But I've seen how capitalism can work wonders in communities.
Thank you. Alba and then Ramiro?
I'm trying to be nice, but not really. I am a communist. I am an Afro-Indigenous. I'm Manabi, Ecuatoriana it's called today. It's coastal Ecuadorian. I've been on this land and have been doing a pre-Marx communism. And so not communism the way people think, like when I think it was Alex said it was about the constellation of power. That absolutely is not communism. Communism is a heterarchy. So the way we see societies is often hierarchical. There's a top, there's a bottom, the wealth is concentrated. In a real communism, in a pre-Marx communism, we know that he got that from us indigenous folks. So we know the Europeans always bastardize our ideas. Marx got that from us. He got it from indigenous people of Abya Yala. And we got our system from Pachamama, from observing how Pachamama works That's how we got our communist systems. And they work in hierarchies. And so basically hierarchies are networks of power that change with various things. Like, for example, changes based on climate, it changes based on catastrophes, it changes based on just variations of relationships. If you could think about it kind of like a barter system, except that resources are allocated based on need, and the working class actually often helps with that structure. And so I'm really sad about the fact that I'm a registered communist, because there are no good communist organizations in the US. There's very, very few. I'm an artivist educator. I've been teaching for about 15 years now, birth through college. And I'm also a PhD student in curriculum instruction and teacher ed. And so hierarchies is what I would say. I would say hierarchical communism is what I'm about. I think that's the only forward with more indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation.
Thank you, Alba. Ramiro?
And I definitely consider myself a communist. I consider myself a non-sectarian, non-denominational communist, if that makes sense. I am not a communist who says you have to be 100% perfect and as a science. And I think in terms of the other ideologies, I just want to say that I kind of have an issue, no offense, Francisco, you're my homie, I kind of have an issue with the way it was framed, because socialism and communism cannot be separated. Socialism is a stage toward communism as a historical era. And I think that they have to be considered as a part of one process, the transition from capitalism to socialism to communism. I am absolutely 100% against capitalism, not only as compañera Alba mentioned, that it is based on the genocide of indigenous peoples, the genocide of African peoples. It is based on patriarchy. It is based on male domination. And so I'm against capitalism, and I would consider myself both a socialist and a communist, because I'm not sectarian. I support any socialist movement with critiques, obviously. No socialist movement is perfect, but I support any movement that seeks to move away from this parasitic system of capitalism.
Thank you. And so final words would be with Arnold.
And I would consider myself on this communist socialist side, but I also have problems with a lot of the way with how Marxism is formed, because it also has certain incongruencies with how indigenous peoples think. Like the way a lot of Marxist movements have these type of the sort of pantheon of communist heroes, Mao, Stalin, Marx, Lenin, when for indigenous peoples, this isn't true. It's a lot more localized. You can see this with like the land reform movements in Peru, where indigenous peoples, or like Saturnino Huilca, the leader of the land reform movement in Peru, viewed heroes like Tupac Amaru, Jose Carlos Mariátegui, who was the first Marxist socialist in Peru, and like the syndicalist leader Emiliano Huamantica is more important than Lenin or Castro. So I think the framing there is that indigenous peoples have their own ways into viewing how Marxism should be developed. But I'm more friendly towards the socialist and Marxist and like communist sides, because they understand that indigenous peoples and in many ways humans have a need for like social and collective well-being and communal living, which I think becomes mismanaged under a capitalist economy.
Thank you for all your responses. Moving forward, which economic system would be most beneficial right now in the US?
It would definitely be socialism, because during the 2008 financial crisis, we saw how badly the Latino community was affected. Accordingly to some figures, the Latino community lost about 25% of its collective wealth. Many people lost their homes, many people lost their businesses. There was no programs in place to really protect people. And even if there was, the programs in place mostly benefited people that had the already economic well-being, who had lawyers, who had accountants that could file the paperwork easily, while Latinos who are, disproportionately lower income did not have the same means to apply for those limited programs. While there isn't really a socialist economy, because every country in the world is capitalist. Every country in the world is capitalist. They have to live within the international capitalist community. So what we experience is certainly not socialism, but what we experience is our social safety nets, which isn't exactly the same as socialism. But the problem is those social safety nets did not exist to catch people when they needed them. And it's happening again with the coronavirus pandemic, where we're going to see so many people lose their homes, lose their businesses, because there isn't any programs in place to protect them. And this will disproportionately affect people of color.
We have climate change coming up. We see the need to move away from a federal jobs guarantee protects the individual as well. Let's be real, because it protects each person's job, like where they were working at before they lost it. Already we see like the collective and the individual are deeply intertwined. They're not saying you're going to go work here now, you're going to go work at the mines, you used to work at a restaurant, but learn how to work at the mines. They're like, no, we're going to protect your job here because that's what you know what to do. And like we're coming into climate change, like that's going to be an even bigger crisis than the pandemic. We need to think about how like we can protect we can protect jobs, the communities, and like the individual people's lives who are going to be affected by it. And I think we need to mix in a lot of both the ingenuity and like both the traditions of communism and communism and like socialist policies with traditional like indigenous knowledge. It's called traditional ecological knowledge, and like according to Winona LaDue. And we can do that and create like a stable communal economy that protects people from losing their jobs in like coastal communities. People who will lose their jobs maybe in fishing in like the Arctic or Antarctic. We like people who may be doing it for centuries or just for the last decade. And I think that's something we need to start thinking about more. Like, how can we provide an economy that's both collective, but thinks about the local and individual needs of each person who like works in their neighborhood economy.
The problem I see with socialism, for example, is that there's still like land ownership. And it's like, we need to rethink how we even think about the land, versus, in Ecuador, for example, they started doing these laws that give humans, that give land, all living creatures, the same rights as humans. And a lot of countries like Australia started following that, Scotland. I think there's like a dozen or so, maybe a couple dozen countries that are doing that now. They're starting to recognize the land's rights. And so, for example, the process there is rethinking the socialism, right? So socialism is like, okay, well, we're going to take some of the capitalist shit. I am totally 110% against capitalism. That is the reason of racism. Capitalism necessitates a hierarchy. Someone has to lose. And it's always going to be anti-Black, always. Capitalism has to be anti-Black. It has to be noticeable oppression. It has to be very easy, targeted. Capitalism is the reason why we are suffering so much climate damage right now, why there's so much poverty, why during the coronavirus, the billionaires are getting richer and the poor people are the only ones bailing each other out. And it's the reason why we have, the reason why we have a police state, the reason why we have militarized schools.
We're really financially well off here in America. And a lot of our excess money, we bring it back to Mexico, to my dad's town, La Piedad. And he's down there, he brings some workers from there here, but he also teaches them how to farm, because like in Mexico, that's all there is to do where we live. So we buy lands, we rent it out to the farmers, we do good rates, because it's not like he's trying to make money. He's just trying to hold the land, because that's his retirement plan. The land, he's going to sell it off when he's ready to retire, and he's going to sell it to the own farmers. But for now, he's like, hey, you guys can use land. We'll keep the land under our name. So when I'm ready to retire, I can sell the land. And there might be some problems between them and us, because it's a lot of land. But yeah, I saw how capitalism brought my dad from nothing, from dirt poor, to now being, honestly, not the 0.001%, but we are the 1% in our state. And yeah, like an immigrant did that, barely any English. And I saw how that affected our life. And I saw what socialism would have done, because I also see people who don't want to work. Like at the restaurants, I see people who just honestly don't want to work, don't want to learn how to work, and just literally steal, lie, cheat, and are scum, if I could say that. And I believe that those people hold people down, and those people start cutting ties in society. And I think capitalist system, when you cut those ties, you're on your own. In a socialist system, those people, or communist system, those people are going to be holding you back and holding you back and holding you back. And I've seen my dad cut people off. Even though he wants to help them, they just fuck themselves over and over and over. And when you have such a big group of people, I don't know what the guy next door is doing with his health, with his body, with his money, with his well-being, because my dad takes care of his restaurants, he takes care of his house, he takes care of his land. And I see people who just don't care about their stuff. They just use it and abuse it and don't leave it better for someone else. And my dad creates value. He takes something shitty and he makes it nice, and then he either sells it to someone else or he profits off of it. And that's the reason why I believe in capitalism, and that's my biggest problem with communism and socialism. Even though I do believe in a mixed economy, that there should be a safety net for certain people, but that safety net only is going to help so many people, because some people are going to either fall through the cracks, sadly, or some people are just going to keep cutting their strings and not going to pull themselves up.
Thank you, Valente. Alba?
I already have a problem just because we're thinking about Latine. I think very Euro, US centric, very cis, hetero, white, patriarchal, able bodied, white imperialist delusional patriarchy. So I think that, like Bell Hooks says, so I think I already have an issue with like just Latinidad that way. So I'm going to focus more on Afro-Indigenous folks. And in reality, the way of living of, for example, Indigenous folks, a lot of what is studied, like the Sumancasay that I mentioned before about from Ecuador, a lot of Indigenous folks are living in very, very prosperous communities that just become terrorized because they're so prosperous, right? They become attacked, they become colonized because they are prosperous communities and because they know that that power system works. And so if we talk about colonialism, get into all that, but I did want to say this in response to what Valente was saying, in that in a capitalist system, you are not 1%. You are, I think, just barely lower middle class, because in a capitalist society, the 1% doesn't work. There is no hard story. It's inherited wealth. It's inherited wealth from land ownership and from slavery. So the 1% doesn't work. I love your story about your family and sending money back. That is communism. You already live in a communist mentality, not economically speaking, but the fact that you give your wealth back to your community in Mexico, the fact that your dad worked hard. Rich people don't work hard for their money. They really, really don't. They exploit others, and that's how they get their money. In communism, we already have free education. We already have free healthcare. Nobody has to worry about food, clothing, and shelter. You work 8 hours, you rest 8 hours, you do whatever the fuck you want for 8 hours. And like that has shown to work in a lot of in various ways on our land, on our Abya Yala, us Indigenous people lived very prosperously for millennia, many millennia in communist systems. So we already have the proof that it works.
So capitalism is a game like any other game. Just like any other game, there's gonna be the 10%, which is the best, like the NBA, the people who just are amazing at playing basketball. There's gonna be people who are amazing at playing the game capitalism, and that's why they're gonna get to the top. I don't think I'm lower middle class. Like, I don't have to work right now, like if I chose not to, because of the wealth my dad has created. But I choose to work because I want to keep creating wealth. I want to be one of the my parents came from Mexico, from a very well-off family, but they chose to come here to America because it was like Romeo and Juliet. They were supposed to be together, and they wanted to be together. So they're like, we're leaving. But with that being said, did you know there's very few families that come from like old money? Most millionaires are first generation. Most billionaires today are also first generation. Like Jeff Bezos made his money from himself. Yes, I do believe that there should be what? Okay, let me just finish this point. Most billionaires in today's society, I do believe, make their own money. And yes, their money works for them because they invest their money in companies that are going to grow and help society. Most billionaires didn't become rich by stealing from people. Most billionaires became rich by providing a service or product towards someone. And a phone, a computer, something. They had to create something for them to get my money. And I don't believe I'm communist because I choose who to give my money to. Like, I don't choose. My dad chooses who he gives his money to. He's like, hey, you're a good worker. I'm going to help you make a restaurant. Hey, you're a bad worker. I'm not even going to talk to you. And that's the reason why in communism, like, you work 8 hours. No, my dad busted his ass off. I saw my dad when I was a little kid. I would not see him for weeks sometimes because he was just working so much. And it takes time for you to build your little empire. And if you're first generation, it's going to take so much more than somebody who has education, somebody who has the money, somebody who has resources. But life isn't fair. Like, that's the thing. And I don't believe making everyone on the same playing field is going to help everyone, because when you're going to drag everyone down. And I don't know. The reason why I believe the U.S. is like one of the richest nations in the world is because of the self-determination of people, for them to become what they want to be, instead of saying like, hey, everyone's going to be the same. This is how we're going to work together. I want to make a car. I'm going to go build a company that wants to make a car. I want to make a computer. I'm going to go build a company that wants to make this computer. And then people are going to come with me, and people are not going to come with me. I'm not going to force. And that's what I like about communism. You force them to do what you want. I'm not forcing anyone to join me, nor am I forcing anyone to live like me. And that's why I don't like communism. And like socialism, it's kind of like, hey, what am I willing to give? And what are you willing to give to me? And that's why I believe a mixed economy between socialism and capitalism is the best, because I'm willing to give something if you're willing to give something. But if I'm not willing to give, this, why should I give it? And how are you going to get it from me? With force?
To extend on that, Dashawn, what do you think about this mixed economy?
When he talks about a mixed economy, that's what I'm talking about too, because I'm trying to figure out how are we going to move from the space of opposition where I need to choose between communism, socialism, which might be on a spectrum, and capitalism. Like, fuck that shit. Like, that doesn't speak to the reality that I see outside my window, including the reality that includes like unending earthquakes in Política, a fiscal crisis that has literally been 500 years in the making and intensified over the last 30 years. Not to mention, like the impacts of, Irma, Maria, and every other hurricane we've had, and so for me, like, unless we can like expand the frame and think about loving distribution networks that are global in scope, that really think about the realities of what it means to lose your island, like I'm thinking about the people of Vanuatu in the Pacific. Or I'm thinking about, like our people, about 45 minutes from my home here in Pantelas that are living where there's open coal ash, just like literally assembled on the beach, blowing in the wind, and not just blowing in the wind, but now that the earth has been shaking, it's literally like, it is the air that we breathe. And unless we can shift the frame and speak to that, like, that's why I won't assume, a label, capitalism, communism, like, fuck that shit. Why do I want to locate myself within a legacy of Karl Marx? No, I work within a legacy that is, indigenous, that is grounded in liberation, that speaks to the earth as her mother. And also speaks to the fat woman in a wheelchair who, screeches in her microphone about like the second coming of Christ. Like, I want to make sure that she's fed and happy so she doesn't have to imagine a better world for herself when she's dead. And that isn't an economic position. That's a position of my heart. And it does have a mixed economic framework because of the world systems in which we live and the reality that I have.
Thank you, Dashawn. Alba, how would you foresee this issue in a hospital in a communist country?
That wouldn't be the case. There wouldn't be a hierarchy where Harvard is number one and this hospital is the best type of hospital. All hospitals would be required to have very high standards. There wouldn't be shitty doctors and shitty hospitals. There wouldn't be a need because everyone would be trained based on the highest. In Germany, for example, I was going to say, which is incredible, my sister is an Ecuadorian person living in Germany who got welfare for 18 months when she lost her job there. Because in Germany, if you lift from the bottom up, everybody, if you educate everybody, the country as a whole rises. So their education system's free. Their healthcare is also free. And they believe everybody deserves food, clothing, and shelter. The ways of the past tell us that the only way forward to thrive on Pachamama on this universe is through interconnected nourishing. And the only way to build that nourishing, nurturing, that strength of learning how to nurture each other is with, I would say, pre-Marx communist systems, or at least, or we can call them heterarchies, because the networking heterarchies are shared power. It's here and there, and the economies it's not like a choice that the government makes to distribute the wealth. That's like a communal decision. That's why I was saying a lot of people's values. I agree with a lot of what Ramos, is that what his name was?
Yeah.
Ramiro was saying, and a little bit of what Arnold was saying. And even what Valente was saying too about your family, you were like, oh, my dad didn't work 8 hours, he worked triple that. Okay, that would never happen in a hierarchical system. That would totally be that just wouldn't be a reality. That would not happen in those systems because it is shared power. And the money, it wouldn't even be a system of money. It would be like more of a barter system. And so if we think about the way capital works, well, that's a whole other conversation, because I just think the issue of how the wealth is built is people over profit, right? And that's the old way of thinking, people over profit. And the system we have now, sadly, it's profit over people. And that neoliberal ideology, that's only been a couple hundred years old. That's what Ramiros, I really appreciated him saying that. Capitalism is very new. It is very new, and this extreme land degradation is also very new. So we know exactly where it came from. And this concept of racial hierarchy is also a couple hundred years old. I'm not saying there wasn't colorism in the past, but not this violent elimination of certain people of color.
Thank you, Deshaun. Ramiro?
There's this myth within capitalism that everyone starts at the same point, because philosophically, the starting point of capitalism is incorrect. If you read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, if you read John Locke, In Defense of Private Property, if you read the what we call classical liberalism, right, which is the foundations of capitalism, that point of view and that perspective was based on colonization, was based on the exploitation of the quote unquote new world. And so the model that existed of capitalism when it was being theoretically formulated about, everyone has an equal starting point. Everything is about choice. If you're poor, it's your fault. If you're rich, it's because you worked hard for it. It's based on a false assumption and a false idealism. It's not scientific. It's not based on the real conditions of society. Because what we know is that, for example, during from the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, the European powers, the colonists, were able to extract resources and labor from Africa, Asia, Latin America, from the global south. There's a great book by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa that explains the fundamental relationship of capitalism that is based on exploitation.
Thank you. And Arnold?
This may surprise y'all, but I actually do agree with Valente on a certain point. I do want people to work, and I don't want people to be lazy. And what was it? And I'm right with you. There are people who are lazy and who won't look for like an opportunity to work. But let's look at the coronavirus, which is affecting primarily Black and Latina folks right now, like in terms of people who are dying and people who are people who are dying and sick, as well as a lot of people who are losing their jobs. What's surprising is that you see a lot of Republican senators calling for a certain jobs guarantee, that instead of allowing capitalism to go on free reign, they're looking for, and some senators like Senator like Josh Hawley from Missouri and Cory Gardner are supporting a jobs guarantee that the government will fund will fund businesses so that they don't go bankrupt and lose the possibilities of giving those jobs back to those workers. Now that's an institution of socialism, that the government itself will use its power and use capital for the benefit of the national economy, for the benefit of using it at the cost of itself for the collective good.
Like personally, the way I've seen capitalism affect my life is my dad came here to America with nothing, and he worked, he didn't understand English. He didn't finish high school in Mexico. My mom didn't finish college in Mexico. I was in their tummy. They were 19 and 20 at the time. And I saw them come here to America, didn't have no language, came to Tennessee State, which is mostly red. And I saw them, how they were helped by many different people, not just white people, but Blacks, Latinos, all these social programs that were around my family for them to succeed. And my dad started as a dishwasher working at restaurants, and he slowly worked his way up. By the time I was 13, he had a couple restaurants, and then there was a crisis. He lost some of his restaurants, but he started again. And now we own many restaurants. We've also expanded into real estate because I think owning the means of production is not just for any like specific group of people. I think anyone can own means production, and that's why I think teaching people about how to make money in a capitalist system is one of the most important things.
It's what was the indigenous communities are the same way. Indigenous communal economies were based on not allowing people to be lazy, because if you were lazy, you died, because then your fields were destroyed or you weren't able to work. But capitalism itself creates artificial work. It also creates artificial demand, because industries create certain products so that they break down, and then so that they become obsolete at a moment's notice, like an iPhone. Your industry doesn't work if your industry doesn't make money if your iPhone is top of the line and won't be surpassed for the next 10 years, because you'll have already met the demands of the market. So if you meet those demands of the market, that already means that you're not going to be making continuous amounts of money. You're not going to be receiving a continuous amount of revenue yearly, which means your economy starts to collapse, because then you start to stagnate. So already you see the flaws within capitalism itself. Whereas with indigenous economies, and like what the attempts of communist economies is to maintain an economy that's stable based on human labor and human need, rather than artificial needs of a market that must constantly be rising up. And with an economy that's constantly rising up, you destroy certain economies and countries who don't want to participate within that economy.
Now, one of the aspects of capitalism is often forgot about is this concept of surplus value, right? What is surplus value? Surplus value is the amount of profit that a capitalist makes after they pay for expenses like wages, like the means of production, right? So for example, if there's a capitalist from the US who owns a sneaker factory, and he can make more money producing those sneakers in Haiti than, for example, in the US, right? And so he's gonna send his factory there, he's gonna bring the wages down, and that margin, that surplus value goes into his pocket. So even though a Haitian worker every hour, for example, is creating a pair of sneakers that's worth like $100, they may only get 10 cents an hour. So they're being super exploited. It's built into capitalism. Exploitation is a part and parcel of capitalism through surplus value. And that's the fundamental, and even people who are pro-capitalist will explain that, the profit margin, right? What's gonna be our profit? Profit is surplus value. And so it's built in the relationship of exploitation. And that's why, moving on to the second point I wanted to make, I don't believe a mixed economy is possible, because they're fundamentally opposite, right? Capitalism and socialism are fundamentally opposite. It's like trying to say we're gonna put like an ice cube into a bucket of boiling water. You know, they're polar opposites. And historically, what we've seen throughout history, as other folks have mentioned, is that we went from a society, indigenous society, where there was no private property. The relations of families were tribal, were collective. And it is only in recent history that people have had private property, land, patriarchy, religion. And so this notion that capitalism is human nature, right? That capitalism, everyone starts equally at the same starting point. We're taking the last 100 or 200 years and generalizing it as the totality of humanity, which is a fundamental mistake. And I think that to wrap up, I just want to say that exploitation is built into capitalism. You can't, it's like water and oil, right? You can't just like mix them together. They're fundamentally different. And so that's why I believe that socialism and communism that eliminates surplus value, where from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, that value is what we should follow.
Having profit or surplus of wages is not exploitation of people, because when I go get a job, so when I was looking for a job, better yet, when I came out of college, I had the freedom to choose between many jobs, and I had the freedom between choosing like, hey, I'm going to pay you this and this and this and this. I do believe. Okay, let me not get ahead of myself. So I had free will to choose what I'm worth per hour. And I started a job. I didn't like what I was being paid. So what I did is I started looking for new jobs, because when I came into the job, I'm like, hey, we're going to pay you this after, your contract from temp worker goes to full time. I went to full-time. They didn't pay me. So I was like, hey, fuck this. You said you're going to do something. You didn't. I left. I went to a new job. Now I'm being paid what I believe I should be worth. And if you don't want to be paid less than what you think is worth, you need to add to your skills. And there's many different ways to add to your skills. Yes, there should be programs that help you add to your skills, and not everyone has access to these programs. And that's what I don't like. And that's what I'm trying to, that's why I believe we should have a mixed economy, but on the capitalist side, because capitalism is what creates the wealth. And with that wealth, we should negotiate like, hey, how much are we going to tax this, and what are we going to use the tax dollars for? And I think we need to get away from crony capitalism, where the government gives handouts to their friends or to kickbacks or stuff like that, because I believe America has too much crony capitalism. 2008 bailouts, a lot of them should have happened. They should have bailed out the people instead of the companies. And the reason they bailed out the companies was because they were going to kickback to the politicians who had stocks in these banks and whatnot. So you should let these there's nothing too big to fail, which I don't like, people saying like, hey, it's too big to fail. No, let it fail. Let somebody else buy it up. Let somebody else with less money buy it up and then make it more efficient, and then they'll be the rich one.
But no crony capitalism, and then government helps the people is just socialism. That's not capitalism. That's just socialism, straight up.
Economy. That's what I'm saying. Like, capitalism is what creates the wealth, and then there should be a safety net for the people. So I don't believe, it should go all capitalism, all, like, hey, wild, wild west, because that's not how society works. We're making a contract here. Like, hey, I'm going to do this if you do this. But if you are forcing me to do something, then I'm going to retaliate against it. So the reason I support capitalism is because right now I live in a country that's mostly capitalistic. I learned how to play this game. I went to school and I studied this form of system. And what I've seen so far is that this one is the one that creates the most wealth. And we can see that by China. China was a communist society. Now it's become crony capitalism, and they've taken their people from, poverty wages, most of their population, to now one of the richest nations in the world.
COVID-19 is showing us that like capitalism, it can survive not just crony capitalism, but it can survive like natural like processes of globalization and disease just spreading around just by the natural movement of how humans move. And that we have like 26 million people who are dying, who are like unemployed in the US, or that's how it's projected by certain Federal Reserve chairmen. And so we're in a crisis where capitalism is being bailed out by like people like Josh Hawley, who's a Republican who agrees more with Bernie Sanders than the corporate Republicans or Democrats. And like even other Republicans are saying like his policy to like guarantee American jobs after the guarantee jobs that were lost during the coronavirus pandemic. Senator or like Representative Scalise, he considers that a radical socialist idea. So already you can see like capitalists recognize that communism and socialist and communist ideas are necessary to save the economy.
Now, in the capitalist system, you find value in different resources, and then you industrialize it. And that way it develops urban centers rather than rural centers. And this creates a profit for many people. Of course, this leads to wealth inequality, and then the rise of property values, and then the unassailable method for people to buy into what is considered the American dream, because it's been bought up by the people that came before. But at the same time, it's that's how part of capitalism developed in American history. But at the same time, the social network policies that we have, which are under attack by both political parties, were developed through socialist parties. The socialist and progressive parties of the 19th century and into the 20th century really pushed the administrations until they got the New Deal with FDR. And this gave Medicare, this gave Social Security, and I believe this also gave unemployment. But it is these programs that really helped create, and it pushed for unions. So it was these programs that really created the middle class from the extreme wealth inequality of the Great Depression. And it's these programs that, even though they aren't socialism, they form a basis of how people can achieve the American dream.
Thank you. And now, Alba, what are your thoughts on revisiting the various indigenous economic systems before any of these three existed for thousands of years?
I support whatever existed before. I support the systems that have worked for millions of years. I believe that capitalism has caused land degradation, as well as the unfair wage system, the hierarchical racial hierarchies, the cis hetero white patriarchal ableist patriarchy. I believe that that's why some folks worked over 12 hours a day to build their worth, and some people worked less than 5 hours a day to build their worth. I believe that capitalism has led to pollution in ways that we never even considered before because of the exploitation of the land and people. And then the people that lose, of course, always people of color, because in capitalism, the racial hierarchy must exist. And so the only way towards Black liberation and indigenous sovereignty, which is my goal, and then that gives everyone else liberation and thriving. Our goal is to nourish thriving. I believe the systems that existed for thousands of years prior were the only ones in which we interconnectedly thrived, where we were able to have a system where there was rest, where rest was part of the day, a large portion of the day.
I mean, I have problems with some of the ways like most contemporary Marxist movements have been constructed, but more so with the capitalist and liberalist side. With indigenous history, liberalism and capitalism has dispossessed indigenous peoples from the land and has pushed them off because indigenous economies were not considered legitimate, not because of any need of like, oh, they're not economically efficient enough to survive, but rather indigenous economies were viewed as non-human. That the fact that they did not produce the land in a way that would befitting to a European sense of economics justified the first colonialists to dispossess indigenous peoples off the land, both the English, the Spanish, and you can see it also with the French and the Portuguese. And it's also the justification for why people like Thomas Jefferson wanted to assimilate indigenous peoples. One, he wanted to mix with indigenous people, which is just a weird story all by itself, and then provide them technology and make them into include them into America. But he did so by assimilating them into the ideal American farmer that did not have any connections with the land through their own indigenous cultural standards, but rather through a European mindset. So it's this idea that you have to work the land in a specific way or you're not legitimate.
Thank you. And Alex, a follow-up?
The indigenous community that I'm from, descended from, the Nawa people, particular Nawa people, their way their society function was that everyone that was born was assigned a duty, and this duty was trained upon until adulthood. And this is how they became part of the societal or community workforce. That type of cultural understanding and acceptance is not part of really much societies nowadays. It's definitely not part of any states that exist now. So to transition from what we have now to that requires a global ideology to take root that hasn't taken root.
But nature is the very basis for an economy, because that's where you get the resources to make food, to make cars, to make a road. You don't get oil without digging into some sort of land. So already capitalism itself, and then that necessitates going into other countries who have certain resources. You see this in the first contacts with colonialists, who wanted to enter into certain land and use it to develop it for farming, but instead of actually treating the indigenous peoples as like equal members, they got them drunk and then had them sign in treaties. through unsavory means. Now, under a capitalist economy, are we going to accept that? Are we going to accept that that is a proper practice? So if we're thinking about ethics, if we're thinking about like, oh, we want to develop something, they're too lazy to actually develop their land. But was it ever yours in the first place to use those means to take that land?
I think as every system that has developed in history, there was a high and a low point, right? I would say, capitalism has a fundamental contradiction within itself. If you've ever read any communist works, so many activists have written about this, is the fact that within capitalism, there's this issue called the falling rate of profit. And within capitalism, it's based on profit and not human need. And so when profits run out, you see the kind of crises that we're seeing around the world right now, where countries like the US, which is so-called the richest empire in the world, is unable to provide for its own people, for Black and brown families and impacted communities. And so I believe that capitalism benefits a small class of people. Capitalists, it benefits white men mainly, at the expense of the exploitation of Black and brown, especially women around the world.
How do we get to the other side? You know, colonialism is the air that we breathe. Like it is the base through which most economic systems operate. And historically that has included communism and socialism. And so for me, especially as they become moral dominant forms. And so for me, like what I'm more interested when I teach business education for decolonization, what I'm talking about is like, how do you balance your expenses, your revenue is, and keep your heart as light as a feather? I'm talking about how do you get your radical enterprise off the ground and you base it on 3 pillars of life. So self-love, beloved community, and true love for Mother Nature as one pillar. Another one is what is your transparent formal exit from white supremacy, toxic masculinity, and the global oil and gas regime. And then third, what is your actual business structure, which might be one thing today, and as you move forward to be something radically different. And I also talk about how do you mix the currencies. And the currencies that I talk about are often like, you know, living currencies. So like seeds and time and food. And then, you know, dying currencies, which I talk about as being like, you know, cash and loans. How do we mix those together to get to this, you know, sort of like, you know, a full moon, like a fuller existence in the world as it now is. And part of the reason why I talk that way is because like, if we stay locked into our arguments, if we stay locked into our historical experiences, it's really hard. I feel, based on my own personal experiences, but also, you know, I'm 45 and I have a PhD and I've been doing this work in movements and elsewhere for years, literally decades. If we stay locked into this historical perspective, it's really hard to innovate and think differently.
Very good. Now, Alba, with your work traveling to Cuba to look at the educational system over there, what did you notice?
School system was incredible. Each student at various stages not only had choice in curriculum, not only had autonomy with curriculum decision-making power and other decision-making power in schools, but they also were very flexible. Like you decided you wanted to be a journalist, and the school system tried to find you support. If they found out that the student was dyslexic, they had special trained doctors to work with the students until they were able to either decide to be by themselves, one-on-one education, or work with the group. And so they make a lot of these individual decisions based on the wide range of variety of abilities. Because that was another population that I think was left out of the revolution, was a lot of people who were differently abled. And that was another thing that we were like, okay, not only going to expand healthcare, but we're going to expand, what is it, the food rationing. They made doctors, and even now I have a friend from the Bronx, a Boricua from the Bronx, she became a doctor in Cuba. She has zero debt. And part of her training was that she had to volunteer for 3 years and just free healthcare to families.
I've heard of that.
Oh, yeah, and I didn't believe it. I did, because I grew up with my communist family. But like when I went to Cuba, it was almost unreal. I actually met people who like, I didn't even pay for these tits. The government even pays for that kind of depending on what your need is. But the healthcare and the ability, it just set an example that I just had never seen, and I just haven't seen leadership like that, where we take not the majority of the population, but a minority of the population, we see like, what do we need? There's a lot of Catholic churches. How do we get some more Santeria normalized, right? There's other faiths, and we need that represented. And that was something that like all the people that got angry, all the racist Christians are the ones that fled to Florida, right? The flight of Pedro Pan and all the Cubans that hate Fidel Castro. A lot of them were the white Cubans, right? They weren't the Afro-Cuban. They weren't the indigenous Cubans. They weren't the Taino.
There has to be a way where you bring both communism and not communism, socialism and capitalism together to form a better society in the future. Because at the end of the day, the only way you create wealth is through self-gratification, self-drive, self-wanting more for yourself. Because if everything's taken care of, I've seen people who everything's taken care of and they become just, they're just going through life.
Thank you, Valente. And on that note, Alba, how does communism understand the individual?
I think that it's interesting to look at Cuba for this example, in which I just think it's really incredible because I don't think Cuba has operated in true communist fashion, but I think it's like on the spectrum, right? It's on a continuum. And one of the things that was a couple of things really incredible when you think about the individual. Fidel Castro received a lot of critique from queer communities, from trans communities, from a lot of the homophobia that was in his own speeches. Che Guevara was anti-women. There was a lot of ugliness that came with the beautiful revolution. And one of the things that came that I have never heard this and anywhere in the world that does this, Fidel Castro not only issued an apology, but he made government-funded free healthcare, even free sex changes. For trans folk, free therapy. Like he extended like what the queer community asked for. The queer community asked for respect. They asked it for places, women and Black Santeria, for example, all the communities that had been oppressed and marginalized when the Spaniards invaded. Fidel Castro literally asked, like, what is it you want? And most of them said, we just want seats at the table. Like we want positions of power. And Fidel Castro, and I'm not saying he's an extraordinary human being and that we should have a holiday and shit for him, but maybe we should. But the fact that he started saying, like, we have government-funded sex operations. We have all sorts, like, all of that is free. We're going to give education free. They turned the literacy campaign. That went from individual effort. That went from, like, serving, like, we're going to not think about the people who are literate. We're going to talk about the large, from the individual population to, like, how do we start to navigate so that everyone's literate so that we can start seeing what is the individual need to begin with. And I'm not saying Fidel Castro did everything that he did was extraordinary, but the fact that he paid attention to the individual shows that leadership can do that. Leadership in, I would say, pre-Marx, again, communism or hierarchical societies, has to value the individual in the community, because there's the interconnectivity is the idea, right? We're all interconnected. And so you can't act alone, even though each person's value and dignity is valued individually. We work together to build around, right? And to prosper together.
And Valente, how does capitalism understand and benefit the collective or the community?
And such.
I think capitalism uplifts communities because it creates wealth at the end of the day. It creates value in something that there was no value in. Sometimes it gets exploited in wrongful ways by force at the end of the day, but it's creating value. It's creating some more monetary value that you can exchange for a good. And that's why I think capitalism helps communities. And that can be in Mexico, that can be here in America, it can be anywhere. It doesn't have to be just in one specific place.
We can learn to do other things, and none of those things need to be capitalist, communist, or socialist. They can be something else. So how does, like my fat neighbor who's in the wheelchair, who is hungry every day, how do we learn to remember she's absolutely wonderfully, perfectly, beautifully human, and she doesn't need to do anything that she doesn't want to do. And she still gets food and a house and dignity and friendship and joy. It's a radically different sort of proposition.
Thank you. And Ramiro, for our closing?
I really enjoyed the conversation. And to be honest with you, even though we have a very diverse group of people here ideologically, I think at the end of the day, a lot of us want very similar things. It's just different approaches. And at the end, it may be a combination of things. And I just wanted to put that out there. So.
And with that said, that is all the time that we have. Thank you all for coming out for this episode of Conversamos. As for everyone at home, make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on all our social media outlets at Conversamos_Latinidad. And tune in next week as we discuss about U.S. imperialism and ICE immigration, classism, and expatriatism. All here in Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. You should help me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator, like a hungry carnivore. When I'm breaking through these heavy doors, this is Desert Storm. A metaphor to show I'm equipped and informed. I'm striking with the mega force, I'm lukewarm, your crew swarms. With the fear, my lyrics do harm. If you ain't lending a hand, I'm breaking your two arms. So listen, I'm sniffing the difference on my mission, I'm craving. I envision